You want to see places and lives of spiritual dryness and ugliness being transformed into beauty? If so, get ready, because this session is going to cover how spiritual awakening brings us to beauty. I'm Magnus Gautestad, your host at the Ideal Classical Teaching Summit, and I'm excited to introduce you to the incredible Travis Wade ZINN from Trinity Foundation. Travis Wade ZINN holds a dual honors degree in history and religion from Indiana University, Bloomington, and a professional diploma in crime and intelligence analysis from Sacramento State. He specializes in Christian mysticism and has studied at several ZEN monasteries throughout the world. He's also the author of Path of Trinity, Journey into Christian Mysticism, and the founder of Trinity Foundation and the ZEN Christian Network. So welcome, Travis. I'm so glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
So we're going to jump into the topic here today, and I just wanted to ask you: can you just give us an overarching, overview of spiritual awakening and how that can bring us to beauty?
Yes. Well, in my case, I'm going to speak from personal experience. It was living 6 months on a Zen monastery, practicing up to 7 hours a day. So how that awakens us to beauty is that we awaken to the synchronicity of the universe. When we function at different levels of consciousness, we have access not only to the forms, but to the meaning that draw them together. And beauty emerges, in my experience at least, it's emergent in lived life, in our consciousness and our awareness, but there's also a verticality to it. So Wolfgang Smith, a physicist and mathematician, wrote very eloquently on this topic. He's also a Christian, and he speaks about verticality and different layers of reality that aren't necessarily co-continuous or connected. So each of those layers, and we can think about Neoplatonism, for example, as a more ancient case of that, each layer has its own internal causality, and it's stacked, which is to say not necessarily connected. So if we're in the material world functioning from a materialist viewpoint, we're going to have a flatness. So that will be reflected in our architecture, that will be reflected in many other things. And so it's only through raising our levels of consciousness that we get access to the forms and to the integrity of all those symbols that actually give meaning. And it's in that dance between the level of causality we work at and higher levels of consciousness that beauty emerges. It's ultimately originating from the divine, from the highest source. So the more we have access to that, the more we can create it in our world. And that's done through spiritual practice.
Thank you much for that overview. There's a lot of interesting things to cover there, but you're talking about getting access to the divine, and this will help us to raise our level of consciousness, and this will then start to reflect itself in how we build our environment, the art we create, and etc. Can you talk a little bit more about how to access the divine?
Well, there are many different approaches, but I think usually it's helpful to have a framework. So even in the kind of antinomian environment of Zen, that's a container. So anytime we're having transformative experience, we're doing that within some kind of container of practice, some kind of container of form. And so before I go further into that, I would look at some of the ways we live within these containers or forms in our modern world. Most people aren't living on a Zen monastery or a Christian monastery. They're not functioning in that very densified container of spiritual symbols and signs and supported reality, but they're functioning in this larger world that most of us have to function in. So I mentioned Wolfgang Smith's verticality as a structure of understanding, and I would add to that ascent. But I would also look at something, since we're looking at aesthetics and architecture, like semiotics. So as a very simple explanation of semiotics, a traffic light would be a sign. And the signifiers would be the different lights on the traffic light. And what they're doing is they're signifying the signified, which is the meaning of those lights. So green means go, yellow means caution, and so on. And so if we look at a word like God, or the Trinity, we could see God as the sign, and the Trinity maybe as the lights, if you will, as a metaphor. But what I was wanting to focus on here, in terms of framing this and looking at containers, is the concept of synchronicity. So how do we awaken to our environment? Well, God would be way too constrained to say God is the stoplight, right? Or God is the colors of the stoplight. So God lives in the synchronicity of all things. So that includes the person stopping at the stoplight. That includes the person walking down the street in a hurry for whatever reason. That includes the light itself, but it's not something that is reducible to that one sign or that one symbol. So we have many symbols that we have in architecture, but they're only meaningful if integrated holistically, and out of that can emerge forms of awakening. So I can walk down the street if I've been practicing deep meditation and be very informed, not just by a sacred environment, by an architectural environment, by a human landscape, by smells. And the more you practice that, the more synergistic it becomes, and more the synchronicity of it comes together. And out of that, you can have insights, even outside of a deep meditative state. You can have insights, and you can also have tools to produce structures, environments, aesthetics, art, music, maths, out of that experience. But it takes the practice of awareness and presencing, which a very good container, like an architectural environment, a psychogeography of that kind, can actually create a densifying, presencing container that can lead to awakening. So it's not just practice as such. It's in Zen we say everything is zazen. Everything, not just the sitting, but the being and the doing, and everything is a prayer, right? Every intention we have is a prayer. So if every thought we have is a prayer, that level of conscious practice, even in our daily lives, before we say something, before we do something, can be a progressive form of enlightenment and awareness. So
I understand. And to connect this now to the classical educators, the classical facilitators, people who are passionate about beauty and truth and goodness, would you say then that a part of how they are teaching people is that they also need to help them to raise their level of consciousness? They need to help them to become more present, because when they are more present, that changes you, and it changes what you will create. So what I'm getting at here is that one of the frameworks that we need to focus on is to wake up, so to speak. And would you say that the modernist environment and the modernist art makes it harder to wake up, so to speak, to become more present, to find these symbols of meaning, and to grow spiritually? Would you say that there is something about that is more connected to a flatness, and that, and that if we are, because I also heard about the disenchantment of the world and the flatness, and one of the roles of artists and architects and those, and for beauty, is to bring back that wonder, that what actually starts you to reflect and to pray and to reach more beyond the materialistic level. So do you have any comments on that, to dig a little deeper here?
So when you look at flatness architecturally or in your landscape, you could also sort of look at pathologies that emerge. So if someone has flatness of effect in a pathology, you would say there's something's diminished. They're not having the full range of emotional or mental activity and engagement with the other. So to look at society and our modern society and our art, we have created so much othering. When we're engaging with people, they're not spiritual beings, and we're not doing Buberin dialogue, Martin Buber, I, thou, that disappears. So that's a flatness of spiritual effect. And that's brought on by our materialism. In terms of our environments, we have these architectures that also flatten out. So when you're living in those environments, you're not truly participating in the full dimension of life. You're living in a kind of social, cultural pathology that's pathologized across spectrums. So in terms of what an artist can focus on, or an architect or a designer, ultimately that has to be going back to classical, I would say, Neoplatonists or Hermetic traditions. And if we've been pre-programmed to have flatness of a spiritual effect towards others, to our environment, we have to break out of that. So you almost have to really disrupt or jam the system. Not, and so people who want to be change agents, first of all, they've got to change their own way of seeing. They've got to change their own perspective. It's not enough to have an ideal, well, I want to design something. That has to live internally. So for that, you need spiritual practices. And going back to Wolfgang Smith's quantum levels, you have to get out of the deterministic causality of the material realm and step up at least into the psychic, if not to the spiritual realm, to pull down those forms that are always there. They didn't disappear. They're in our psyche. You know, Lacan said the unconscious is structured like a language. And that language of the unconscious or the superconscious, you know, Chomsky would talk about mentalese, which is a fundamental underlying language out of which other languages emerge, or Jung would talk about the archetypes. So there is this undercurrent or overcurrent of truth, justice, beauty, harmony. But to bring that back into the world, it has to come inside. So that's where deep meditation practice and practice that's contemplative practice can help. So if you're wanting to work with symbols, forms, you would do contemplative work with those symbols and forms. So deeply go into them, then go into the meditation and try to access those forms that are existing above and pull them down into your psyche so you can have creative output, because that's not going to come automatically if the psychogeography is where you live and there's this distance with the other. So you have to break through first yourself, and that can be done through meditation and prayer.
I understand. So thank you so much for clarifying that. And I think you bring up a very important point, which is one of the main themes at this summit. And that is that the mind can really be one of the makers and breakers of a revival of beauty. It's such a key not to just focus on the world systems and externally, but you know, all honor to those who works within politics to kind of manage the damage that has been done, and trying to create some sort of control over the evil and all of that. And there's a place for that. But ultimately, for a long-term sustainable revival of beauty, it needs to be a change of the mind and the heart of people. And I think you touched on that. And these disciplines are becoming present, of meditation, of contemplation, which
contemplative prayer. Mm-hmm.
Right. And that is something that, when, for example, we are going to take in a more complex piece of music, a more complex piece of architecture or art, it requires us to find peace and presence, and to really contemplate and to be there for us to really take in all the beauty and meaning which is there, right? And in our fast-paced world, many have been trained to not be able to go that deep. But as you're saying here now, that the spiritual practices, presence, contemplation, are areas that will help people to change their mind, change their perception, create things differently. And of course, there is many other interesting layers we could go more deeply into there, but we're going to try to keep this pretty actionable. And then our dear attendees, will be able to ask Travis questions during the Q&A session to get more details. And we will be doing that since he's not present here with us today. He will be doing that in our Facebook group, our Together for Beauty Marketplace group. So keep an eye on information about how you can follow up with questions to Travis. But Travis, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I would leave one semiotic koan for everyone. It's from the poet Charles Bukowski. And he said, the people look like flowers at last. So I think working with something like that would be really good for meditation practice. Yeah.
Well, thank you much for giving a concrete step. And I actually wanted to follow up with that now. That do you have some concrete things people can do to implement what you have said today? So they might have a little to-do list after this session and say, this is a way that I can practice to awaken more spiritually, so I can bring about more beauty into the world.
Well, 15 minutes of meditation practice a day, 15 minutes of contemplation on some art form or musical form. When you have the opportunity, go into spaces, whether they're sacred spaces or meaningful spaces culturally or otherwise, even nature, which offers up its own forms. And you mentioned the thing with modernism, how it's collapsed art, and you asked me, what did I think of that? One of the last kind of gasps, you might say, and I'm not discounting all other forms that came after, but just to focus on it, was surrealism, right? So we had this disruptive artistic event that caused people to have their mind jammed. So one of the practices of surrealism, I'm not leaving practice, one of the practices of surrealism was derive. So people would walk down the street and be in that psychogeography, right? So they were in that container. It was actually a practice. So that, interestingly, is a practice. If you can disrupt, that's what the koan does, but if you can disrupt your conception, just try to distort things so you can bring them back together. So that's actually a practice that can create some revelation and can be done whenever.
Can you be a bit more specific of how that would look like? So, for example, if I'm now after this session or tomorrow wanted to do this disruption, can you explain that from one more angle so we're sure that we can grasp that action step?
Imagine the building with the funny hat. You got to really break down what you're seeing, and sometimes that means just mentally totally restructuring it and then let it come back to you. What does it come back after it was flat and then it had a hat? And you've been meditating on Platonic forms or whatever. There you have something. You may have a new building there.
Yeah, I understand. So this is one ways of engaging us on another level, because sometimes we are blessed with beautiful, inspiring symbols and surroundings. Other times we might be not. But the way we engage with it, we can do something to stimulate such a process that you're talking about there. And that will leave room for the imagination, and that can warm us up for contemplation, as you're saying, and ways to break the flatness that I believe puts very money in a feeling of isolated and depressed, even also, because I believe it's not the way that we've been created, and that's something we need to get back to, something that has been lost here. So what would be like one key takeaway here that you would just leave our listeners with from our talk today, if it was like one thing that they should remember?
Meditate every day at least 15 minutes and practice gratitude. That brings to you. So
thank you very much. I really appreciate that we bring in the spiritual perspective here. We are talking about beauty. We are also talking about faith and seeing how there are connections between both of them in an approachable way, as we are having a wider movement from many different disciplines. And it's great that we now can see who are seeing the same benefits of beauty for our different missions, and also are concerned about the direction that modernism has been a threat and has also destroyed in many ways things that we hold very dear. And it's great just that we can come together and learn from each other in this common mission for beauty. So thank you so much, Travis. It's been a great joy. What are some ways that people can learn more about this? Do you have any resource that people can go to after this talk?
Outside of what I do personally, I recommend the World Community for Christian Meditation. They do retreats in, for example, Bonvaux, France, or London. So they have a lot of tools, and as if you're a Christian, they have very specific practices that you can work with. I myself do ZINN, but I'm a Christian. And so you have that. And also, I have started the ZINN Christian Network. I'm getting my site up. It's for Christians to actually get together, because I think community and being together, actually, which we haven't mentioned yet, is very important. If we're all atomized, we're not really having synergistic work and awakening together. So the idea with that is to have actual groups that physically meet. You got a geolocation so people can, and disciplined meditation. It's not enough to just, oh, I did a little meditation. If you really want to reach up through the vertical levels and bring something back, that's more than 15 minutes a day. So also the Trinity Foundation, which I've started, also provides some tools. So you can find me on Facebook or on Twitter, likewise.
Wonderful. And we will be linking to each of the speakers on the Meet the Speakers page on our website. And there you can easily get connected with Travis Wade ZINN. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and for all our attendees and speakers. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you, sir.